This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
It's great to hear from Justin Champion, who's probably needs no introduction, but as President of the Historical Association, Professor of the Early Modern History of Ideas at Royal Holloway, and has been in many ways a pioneer of public history, and certainly for me has been both a bit of a mentor and an inspiration. So I'm delighted to introduce him. Over to you, Justin.
Thank you very much. The last section of my paper has been left in the in the printer, so I'm going to busk for that, which is very helpful. I was asked to give a title, and I came up with one that's quite daft, really, but I will try and talk around it. Making public, making a difference. Designing research questions with a public purpose. And really what I was trying to get at in that rather clumsy set of phrases is, if we imagine ourselves as public historians, what do we think we're doing? You know, how did I, as a 54-year-old, end up, you know, after years of O-levels, A-levels, you know, interminable readings of Nehemiah and George III, end up doing what I'm doing now? At what point was it possible to say that there was a theme that connected in some way with the public? I suspect it was probably fairly early on, partially for biographical reasons, that my father went to university as a mature student through the WEA. Tragically for him, he read English, but at quite a historic university. So I was brought up in the 60s in Cambridge and saw historians who are now all eminent or dead, anthropologists and whatever. And it gave me a sense, especially the WEA dimension of it, that academic life was a privilege, and I think it was Ludmilla said, you know, what's the opposite of public history? I think there is a thing called private history. It's when we publish monographs that cost 180 quid and 6 people buy them. It's sort of not quite vanity publishing, but it's scholarship, it's erudition, so of course it's very important. But I think we've somehow lost our way. So I want to invoke the great historian Max Bygraves. I want to start by telling you a story drawn from my experience at delivering a pretty tough paper, challenging liberal assumptions about the rights of religious conscience against other suffering and tender minds and against the state. One of those moments, and this is drawn from the research I do at the moment into the intellectual life and context of Thomas Hobbes. One of these moments was at a very enjoyable and engaging conference in the USA. The conference itself will result in an important collection of essays under the theme of God, the Enlightenment, and secularization. The other moment took place at quite a distinguished British university. Now, my contribution in both cases explored Thomas Hobbes' attitude to conscience, which he regarded with some deep scepticism. His accounts and defence of the needs of the state in the name of civil peace to discipline and punish public expressions of heterodoxy were the theme I was exploring. He had absolutely no anxiety about private expression, even accepting, quite uniquely for his time, that atheism was a plausible intellectual position to hold as long as he put it, it was held in private, because private is in secret and therefore free. Hobbes regarded most organised religion as pathological. Clerical, you might see where I'm going. Clerical claims to inspiration, to act as ambassadors of God, to channel the divine plan, were regarded as delusion, idiocy or madness, or a form of collective imposture. Churchmen and inspired individuals had caused all of the wars in human history. His solution was a radical form of Erastianism. The state should define what is truth, what was authentic revelation, and who might act as clergymen. There was no legitimate conscientious grounding for public dissent. So he's writing in 1651, he says, as a consequence, a sovereign might impose, for example, the Quran as the public scripture rather than the Old and New Testaments. Now, nobody's thrown anything at me yet, but in Ohio and East Anglia, this did not go down well. I was furiously upbraided for denial of God, for invoking a fallen and evil mind in the form of Thomas Hobbes, and for illegitimate use of the Holy Book. There was absolute rage in some quarters. And of course this provoked me to explain in further detail Hobbes' plans for dealing with godly conscience, which at one point he suggested should involve the collective massacre of all churchmen to prevent future civil war. Which, given the circumstances he was writing in, he said if we'd killed 1,000 clergymen, we would have saved 100,000 lives. Might be the same in Syria or elsewhere today. The charge of being a defender and admirer of Pol Pot was levelled at me. Now, I would claim that the ideas I propagated and discussed were the authentic expression of early modern sources, recovered by research and developed into a plausible account. Admittedly, the arguments run up against the dominant Lockean liberal account of the rights of tender religious conscience and the withdrawal of the state from any more than an arbitrating role in managing different religious commitments. Is this the lesson that we should eschew historiographically innovative research which might pose or challenge contemporary shibboleths? Should we ban Hobbes from being read because he suggests that all religion is the product of human will and therefore mainly corrupt and self-interested? Now, it'll be very clear to you, I hope, that the themes I've very roughly outlined in my account of Hobbes have an absolute and powerful resonance and perspective on our contemporary world. Understanding the conventional and historical origins of religious doctrine and institution delivers a powerful set of perspectives for thinking about the contemporary world and the threat of terror, fundamentalism, and the visibility of religion. The parallels between the vilification of popery and that of Islam today is profound. The assassination and plotting of the Jesuits and Guy Fawkes are a foundation for thinking about more contemporary episodes. The contradictions between John Locke, the so-called apostle of religious freedom, who, while doing so and being celebrated today by most liberals, also outlawed Roman Catholicism and atheists, nobody seems to see that as a contradiction, is perhaps to point to the complexity of the role of religion in the modern world. Now, I don't expect a public audience to plough through the dry, over-footnoted and expensive studies that are out there on Hobbes and Locke. But I've been given ample opportunity to explore these ideas in dialogue with other contemporary minds, debating with voices from the Muslim and Christian communities, alongside the powerful mind and voice of Daniel Dennett on the Radio 3 series, Free Thinking, allowed a robust and engaged exchange. Nobody accused me of being Pol Pot, which was a benefit. More recently, in this building, perhaps in this very room, we hosted a public discussion about the trans-historical and national nature of religion, led by the distinguished Chicago historian of religion, Henry Lincoln. And again, despite the dangers of offending someone's piety or sensibilities, in all of these moments, the historian, not just me, but others, were clothed in the protective armour of research. It wasn't just us being mean and nasty, it was stuff we'd read about. More recently, I've had the privilege to deliver a short series of programmes on ideas of tolerance, and it's my great sadness that Lisa Jardine was going to be in one, but unfortunately was too busy, so we didn't have that opportunity. But the opportunity to talk with other historians and with other religious voices about the difference between tolerance and toleration, located in the historical context of Brick Lane, where the church that is now a mosque was originally a Huguenot church, and then in the 18th century used by the Jewish community. That opportunity as a public historian allowed me to interview voices from each of those communities, but also pose present-centered questions. How do we live together? How do we tolerate each other's moral and religious differences when we no longer share a common ethical heritage? And since that broadcast, and this is perhaps the most depressing but perhaps the most interesting, I've been invited to contribute historical perspectives for the proposed anti-terrorist prevent legislation that needs to engage with our understanding of what it is to tolerate other people's views. I mean, my views are right, yours are radical and wrong. Surely that's what we all say, isn't it? So, I've bored you probably for far too long about Hobbes and religious toleration, but I want to sort of establish to you the issue of how we come to our research topics. I think the first moment that the thread of what I've been interested in appeared in my mind was during punk, having just seen The Clash, 1976. And I came back from that fairly noisy, and I kept thinking, why should I take anybody else's opinion seriously? What is it? You know, teachers tell me rubbish, my parents tell me rubbish. Why? Johnny Rotten doesn't tell me rubbish. He tells me what's right. Some of the other bands weren't so good. But that question of why, what is it? What sort of social circumstances or intellectual traditions would I bow the knee and recognise as respectful? Find something naughty and controversial. That always used to go through my mind, and people will listen to you. If you study the nepotism of mid-1760s politics of Parliament, well, maybe they would be interested now, because I suppose it's all very relevant again with lobbies and interest groups. But one of the things I think we all need to recognise, and this will offend some people, I'm sure, that we all have a position in the world, and we all have a perspective that we may not articulate that often, but that really is at the core of who we are. And after 30 odd years of doing history, I'm more and more convinced that if we're true to that inner belief or conviction, then we write and produce history that can connect with other people's convictions. And I'm very, very interested in thinking about how, especially early career historians, whether they're 16, 18, 22, how do they come to the topics that they study? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Of course, the issue of public history has become contaminated, in my view, by impact. Not only the ref ambition, much of which I agree with. If we're all publicly funded, if we're given the privilege of spending decades sitting in libraries, thinking, writing, rather than working on a till in Sainsbury's or, heaven forfend, going down a pit, this is a huge privilege, and we need to pay back that privilege. We are publicly funded. But you'll notice there's a new generation of web things in particular. Has anybody come across in their institution something called The Conversation? If you haven't heard of it yet, you will do, because pretty much every university has signed up to it. And they say, we're going to encourage and help you. I'll read some of their... We're going to inform public debate with knowledge-based journalism that is responsible, ethical, and supported by evidence. Fantastic. There'll be a lot of journalists out there deeply hacked off, I imagine. They will offer, I quote again, the public with clarity and insight into society's biggest problems. Importantly, this project claims it will, and this is the most peculiar dimension of it, I have been in correspondence with them, support and foster academic freedom to conduct research, teach, write and publish, to ensure that we are operating for the public good. I didn't see anywhere on their webpage the offer of research grants, and it looks suspiciously to me that a lot of vice-chancellors have signed up all of our intellectual property, because believe me, if you're invited to publish on their website, they'll give you a turnaround of about a day and a half. Brilliant. Yeah, that's the way historians really work. You know, give us a question, day and a half time, bang, sorted, no problem. Now, I'm very sceptical about some of this ambition. Agenda setting by third parties who claim to recognise society's biggest problems. Well, you know, that's a 5-day conference, isn't it? Society's biggest problems.
Next year.
And unless we just identify it as a certain Chancellor of the Exchequer, sorted out. I mean, to recognise society's biggest problems as the grounding for encouraging, their words, support and foster serious research seems a challenge both to the independence of the universities and to all of us, but also to the funding councils. You know, is it really for a third-party journalistic enterprise? You know, why not the Sun rather than the Conversation? The Sun setting our research agendas would be quite illuminating, I'm sure. Now, more recently, in the Historicist Manifesto, we've had a statement from Armitage and Goldie. They delivered a bold, if contestable, proposal. I mean, it's an engagingly written, powerful book, ambitious, and in one sense rests on a long tradition of academic insight and reflection. And it draws from David Canadyne's 1987 paper, which issued a hostile account of both the expansion of the discipline and the balkanization of the subject of history in universities. Armitage and Goldie reflect on the consequences of those insights and recommend some resolutions to the failure, if you like, of historians to act effectively in the most public of spheres, the political sphere. At the heart of their proposal is a call for historians to recognise their potential role for informing public moral and political discourse, to examine some changes in historical practices which would further that ambition. And their argument is a simple one. We should develop big history. I mean, it's such a masculine thing to argue, isn't it? Which explores a long-term and a long-range past. They lay out a case which suggests that a change in how we undertake historical research, and indeed design research questions and projects, will lead to a refurbishment of history's place in public discourse. While these proposals are bold and indeed challenging, I really don't think they're very convincing. And there are a number of perspectives that relate directly to whom we are, that ignores or marginalises certain types of history and historians. Their major failure is to answer the simple question, who are the historians? Who are we? The proposal has a very unreflective account of who historians are, who will be empowered, who will trip down the corridor to Obama or Osborne to inform public debate. And I think this is a serious lacuna, given the debates around public funding and the universities in both North America and the UK. The sort of argument developed recently by Collini might address some of the sociological issues and think about, Collini wants us to think about the intellectual, social, moral characteristics that historians ought to accrue and develop in order to be able to comment on public issues. Currently, though, this argument is unanchored from the question of public integrity. I think the Historicist Manifesto essentially argues if only historians did a different type of research, they would be in a better position to speak to and for public concerns. I'm really dubious about that. A long history of the rise of the role of the rabbit in the medieval economy, not really going to excite a lot of people apart from rabbit breeders, perhaps. Now, connected to that is an inquiry into the social identity of the historian. Their proposal as it stands ignores the question of public history. It's hardly used in that book. Now this is bizarre, given that they both write out of an American perspective, where, and in Australia in particular, where the public history project is well established, but also the public history project in the UK has been going a few years now, so you would have thought at least it should be something to be engaged with. History is already a powerful discourse in various public spaces, perhaps more profoundly as entertainment rather than instruction, but it's there in digital media and in museums. How the dimension of engagement and impact, remember both of those projects were originally coming out of the Treasury and were about value for money. They weren't about any cultural ambition. Their claim that after 2,000 years, Western history's mission to be the guide of public life has apparently collapsed is more than contentious, it's just wrong. The position of historians to inflect public discourse in high-end political circles or in the pages of the New York Review of Books may be in decline, but I'm not convinced that that works in the UK. If we look at television, film, and more significantly the growth of activity among community and oral historians, there's a lot of activity going on. We may not have a big brand that we like a footsie, week by week, how much public history did you see this week, but why not? A further dimension would be, I think, to challenge them over the way they think the universities have a role. There used to be something that came out of Scotland called the democratic intellect, that the investment of money in the universities was about creating a public good and a better educated citizenship. Even Alistair MacIntyre, in his short paper, The Idea of an Educated Public, argued that a better educated, historically educated public would make a better citizen body, and that would make society overall better. Now obviously those are bold claims, but we might look at what's happened in Scotland in the last year or two and draw some conclusions from it. Now, I think the book has received a great deal of attention, and it certainly received a lot of attention amongst a certain brand of professional historians. But I don't think it's really it hasn't become public history. There aren't people marching down number 10 saying, more public historians in government. That would be, maybe Jeremy Corbyn would be interested in that. I don't know. Perhaps we can gain some funding from him. I'm very sceptical that it will attract the eye of those beyond the academic world, partially because the recommendations it makes are internal to the discipline, rather than an ethical reflection on the business of the discipline itself. There's so much institutional talk today, and it's the world, I'm glad I'm 54, because I'm not sure I'd do it again. I think you probably make more of an impact on the world making a loud noise with a guitar. Perhaps, maybe that's fantasy. But this notion of inspire and engage, assess impact, is, I think, very problematic. And the idea that every minister in power has a couple of historians sitting outside their office ready to guide them along the rocky path of their stupidity is really problematic. Historians do have powerful perspectives, but who will those historians be? We have to recognise that there is a sort of sociology to university positions, and there's a web of connections. Nepotism is probably too strong a word, but the public sphere, I think, is a better place for historical contributions than the historian as political lapdog. And we need to think hard about influence. Has Downton Abbey made people think harder about the sort of real life of living below stairs? Was it better than upstairs, downstairs? Who knows? Show my age again. But I want to give you a few reflections now on quite a way forward. My own activities in the last year or so, as Stephen will attest to, we were rather obsessed with Magna Carta because of the 800th anniversary. And I'm not a medievalist, but I had encountered Magna Carta as a 17th century historian, and from that platform was able to draw out a lot of present-centred arguments that, in particular, for example, emphasised the tradition that RHUL in 1969-70 drew from a Magna Carta tradition in the same way that John Lilburn did, to legitimise his protest and demand for a free trial. Now, I can tell you, amongst certain judicial circles, there's a lot of head shaking in the audience. What are you talking about RHUL for? It's got nothing to do with Magna Carta. He did. He invoked Magna Carta to demand trial by his peers, and he was successful. One stage further, having immersed myself in Magna Carta ideas, receptions, the government of Papua New Guinea has just issued a Magna Carta for the poor, insisting that access to water, to electricity and education is a right from now on. I took opportunity to contribute to the Parliamentary Committee on whether we need a new Magna Carta or Constitution, very carefully hidden away on their website in June, calling for the entire nation to comment. But they forgot to tell anybody about it. So I submitted evidence from Magna Carta and indeed from the levellers and the diggers, and indeed it was accepted as evidence and written into their parliamentary report. I won't read it out, but the comment was quite apt, I think. In a rather robust way, Professor Champion argued that most political figures today are corrupt and, well, I was only using that. I mean, I just rewrote bits of the agreement of the people, but they didn't know that because they're not historians. So in one sense, we could say that's the sort of function as a public historian, that we are empowered. We have a repertoire of things that we can do. There are other ways of thinking about impact, of thinking about our duties. And I just want to pick up on something that Ludmilla said this morning. This was a bit I lost, so I can rewrite it. The idea that we all have, or should have, a toolkit of skills and training, plus, an important sort of qualification, the will to use them. I think that's key. I wanted to pose the question, what sort of historian are you? How did you become a historian? How do we come to a subject? Some of us get duffed up by our tutors. I've got some money, you can do this. Others, some have tripped over something significant that we really want to find out about. But if we think about the processes of how that happens, how we get to be professional historians, we have to jump through a lot of hurdles. We have to have academic success. You've seen the bitter disappointment of people will be talented historians who've just missed the first and therefore won't qualify for funding an undergraduate curricula. I mean, that determines very much the way in which we think about the past. So there are a lot of obstacles until that ambition of having a toolkit of skills and trainings impacts at undergraduate level and potentially even at A level. I think we're going to be fighting, in one sense, a losing battle. My view is that still higher education historians, in a lot of respects, regard themselves as belonging to a very fine club. And it is a private club, and you have to pass certain criteria and jump through certain hoops to get into it, and that we need to bust that door open. In one sense, I think one of the themes of the other papers we've heard today, one of the great losses that as public historians we miss is the mature student and the WEA. You know, when I started teaching in the very early 90s, late 80s, 1/4 of the students I taught were mature students. Now we're lucky if we get 1 in 50 because of the funding changes. Lord knows what happened to the WEA, but you know, I went to a WEA meeting in Windsor about 5 years ago, and it held its meeting at Cumberland Lodge. And I'd never seen so many Mercedes and Bentleys outside. I still don't understand how that was the WEA, but perhaps they were coming on behalf of their workers, I don't know. But I think one of the other phrases that one of you used was that public historians, the thing that defines them is not necessarily the sort of history they're interested in, but this idea of social activism, that they want to make a difference in the world and see their fortune to have become public historians or historians with a public remit as something that they can use as a platform to make a difference. Thank you.